India does not have a direct border with China. India has a direct border with Tibet. Tibet is a region in China. India and China have a direct border and dispute that arises out of it because Tibet is a part of China, right? So that's the historical point that we have to understand, that insofar as Tibet remains a part of China, China is going to have a problem with India with regard to its border areas. And therefore, we have to see how India Tibet border has been organized. So, to understand a bit of a context of this entire activity, please be sure to make sure the point that India, how is it organized its border with Tibet? That's the real question that we're going to ask. Right? And this is basically going to be defined into what you can call these perspectives. First, we'll take a look at what is known as the Johnson line. Okay. Then we'll take a look at what is known as the McCartney line, what is also known as the McCartney-Macdonald line. Okay. These two lines exist in what is known as the western sector. Now, please be mindful of the terminology that I'm using over here. Johnson line and the McCartney-Macdonald line, these two lines are used in what is known as the western sector. Okay. In addition to this, you have what is known as the McMahon line. This is a line which is used in the eastern sector. And the last and final manner, which is basically the problematic part, which is known as the line of actual control, or what is known as the LAC. LAC is a concept proposed by the Chinese to alter the border marked by Johnson line and McMahon line. Just take a sense of this part, please, class. Now, this is going to be important from the prelims perspective because these lines can come into multiple choice questions very simply and easily. Right. The point that we are basically concerned with at this point of time is this, right? If you take a look at, for example, the parts of, let's say, Kashmir, attempts of the Britishers to settle their border with Tibet. The entire activity of India-China, in a way, border dispute arises in this history, right? If you give it a bit of a subtitle. So at the time, the Chinese had the Qing dynasty. The dynastic control of the Chinese was placed upon Tibet, but Tibet was also a kind of individual autonomous body at the time, right? So if you take a look at this region right here, how Tibet finds itself in this particular scenario. If you take a look at it, this is what is the entire Chinese mainland. This is Tibet, this is Xinjiang, right? The East Turkestan and the Tibetan regions. Now, the question around Tibet is very simple. You see this area, this is basically the border that is there between India and Tibet, right? So you have a very simple understanding of how this is happening. Now, the Britishers had found Tibet to be of specific importance with one particular aspect, that they wanted to create a security against the oncoming of the Chinese. So I had already explained to you how the Britishers wanted to create a security for themselves with regard to the movement of Russians into the Indus Valley regions. To be able to secure the movement of Russians in the Indus Valley region, the Britishers had created what you call they had moved in areas of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan into the Indian territory. That's basically what they had done to be able to control that area properly, right? So they could have a frontier against the coming of the Afghans or the Central Asians or the Russians into the territories of India in terms of Indus Valley civilization. Now, if you take a look at the Tibetan plateau, just think about this as a map over here. This region was Tibetan region. It was under the control of the Tibetan leadership, and the remaining region was China. We're talking about, let's say, year 1865, 1867, somewhere like this. Okay. Now, just imagine a bit of an alternate map. imagine this entire situation like this, that the parts which are currently marked in Kashmir, this was all a part of the Tibetan Plateau. So what the Britishers did was, let's say, take a look at this. I am going to mark this in yellow, right? Now, what you see basically in marked in yellow, or completely, covered in yellow, just let me be very clear, is the Tibetan Plateau, right? So this part which I'm marking is the Tibetan Plateau. What the Britishers do with regard to negotiating with the Tibetans, they say to the Tibetans that we are going to extend our positions from India slightly forward, and we're going to take certain control of your areas. Okay, so this was the kind of a proposal given by the Britishers, just like the Anglo-Afghan War led to the creation of the, what you call, the Durand Line. But in the Durand Line, the Britishers had gone slightly ahead of the Indus and the Sindh and the Punjab regions into the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa mountains and taking certain territories from the Afghans and attaching it to the British Indian territory. Similarly, the Britishers, while they were negotiating with the Tibetans, Tibet is a plateau, right, and with intersecting mountain ranges. Now, what the Britishers wanted to do was to make sure that the plains of Jammu, now I have given you some kind of an understanding of how Kashmir is placed, right? Kashmir is like this. You have Gilgit-Baltistan, you have the Kashmir Valley, you have Jammu Plains, and this entire region is Ladakh. So we are talking about this region. Britishers wanted to take control of certain areas in the Tibetan Plateau and attach it to the Indian territory to be able to raise their ability to occupy the plateau region to detect a upcoming warfare. You see, so if you see this is a plateau region and then it tapers out into a plain area, right? If this is a plateau region, if it tapers down into a plain area, this is what basically leads in the Tibetan Plateau into the Jammu Plains, right? Now, the Britishers were present till Jammu Plains. They wanted to capture some more territory and be in areas where the Tibetans had access to the plains of Jammu via a plateau region, right? So what the Britishers did was they started negotiating with the Tibetans in such a manner. Britishers were a big power at the time, so the Tibetans had to yield in the negotiations. They started saying that we are going to take certain parts of the Tibetan Plateau and attach it to the British Indian territory and marked the Tibet-India border, right? Now, in two sectors was this marking done. If you can see, for example, here, this part is known as the western sector. Okay, and this part where you call Arunachal is known as the eastern sector. So over a period of time, what the Britishers did was they took certain areas of the Tibetan Plateau and they marked it as a part of the British Indian territory, right? That area we now call Ladakh, right? So Ladakh was marked as a part of the Indian territory and formalized as a part of the Indian territory by the Britishers, and therefore the line which was delineating the Tibetan region and the Indian region, including the Ladakh region, part of the Tibetan Plateau marked to India, this was known as the Johnson Line. The Johnson Line was formalized in 1867, when the Tibetans had started agreeing, but eventually out of force, that these parts of the Tibetan Plateau are marked with India. This was the Johnson Line. And similarly, the Britishers moved slightly above in terms of these areas into the Tibetan Plateau region and started marking this part. Please take a look at this. this part of the Tibetan Plateau also as a part of the British territory in India, and therefore they created a border in the western sector. The border in the western sector, as all of you are aware, came to be known as the McMahon Line. You see, and McMahon Line was finalized in 1914 by what was known as the Simla Conference. These were two agreements which were signed between the Britishers and the Tibetans, which had created a movement by which the lines between the Tibetans and the British government of India was signed. Right? In the eastern sector, this line was known as the Johnson Line. Right? And the Johnson Line moved from the region of Ladakh till the region of what you call here Nepal. So from point here to point here, the line which was dividing India from Tibet came to be known as the Johnson Line. Right? And from point here to here, the line which was dividing the territories from Bhutan till Myanmar came to be known as McMahon Line. But in these two conditions, the Britishers had taken this strand in the eastern sector and this strand in the western sector and marked these parts as a part of the British Indian Empire, which earlier were claimed by the Tibetans. You see the point? This was the beginning of the dispute. That what the Tibetans did was they claimed this part to be their territory, and the Britishers forced the Tibetans to give this territory to India and finalize a document with them. Because the Britishers were powerful, the Tibetans had to relent. But the Tibetans never really necessarily acknowledged the legitimacy of the Johnson Line and the McMahon Line, and still considered these areas to be part of the British Indian, to be part of the Tibetan territory. Later on, two things happened. Number one, India got independence, and the Republic of India inherited the Johnson Line and the McMahon Line from the Britishers, which made the Johnson Line in the western sector and McMahon Line in the eastern sector the international border between India and Tibet from India's perspective. So these territories we inherited from the Britishers. That became our inheritance from the Britishers. So that is what we said were the defining lines between Tibet and India. The Johnson Line and the McMahon Line. Johnson Line made in 1967, McMahon Line made in 1914. Agreement signed by the Britishers became our basis to have a claim on these territories. And later on, by the 17-point agreement, Tibet became a part of China, of the People's Republic. The people of Tibet signed an agreement of accession, by which what is known as a 17-point agreement, by which Tibet became a part of the People's Republic of China. And once Tibet had become a part of the People's Republic of China, the Chinese started claiming that they don't give acceptance to the Johnson Line and the McMahon Line. They don't give any acceptance to the Johnson Line and McMahon Line. And instead, on the other side of it, they proposed that the areas which previously belonged to the Tibetans should now be given back to the Tibetans, because Tibet is now a part of China, and therefore these should be given back to the Chinese. And as an alternate idea to the Johnson Line in the western sector and the McMahon Line in the eastern sector, which the Chinese called parts of what you can call Chinese call this as parts of British imperial policies. Right? They rejected the Johnson Line and McMahon Line, and they proposed an alternate idea of the India-China border, which means India-Tibet border, which they call the line of actual control. Right? And what was the line of actual control? The line which is running in yellow, you can see it over here. This line which is running in yellow, they called the real India-China border, known as a line of actual control. This is what the Britishers had proposed, and that is what became the what you can call the reason for disagreement between the Chinese and the Indians by 1962, which had led to a war between the two countries. the different interpretations of what should be the line of actual control, this became the problem with regard to which countries were supposed to take a understanding, and it could not develop into an agreement, which led to the 1962 war. And eventually 1962 war, the Chinese entered into the Indian territories at both ends in Arunachal and Aksai Chin and captured areas so that these areas could be turned into Chinese occupation area, and that is where they occupied Aksai Chin based upon what we understand as the line of actual control, right? Class, do we understand this? Are we getting a sense of how this is working for us with regard to the Johnson line, the McMahon line, and the line of actual control? In very brief senses, though this is a rather more difficult and complicated chapter in a full classroom, but I'm trying to communicate to you this idea of why the Chinese and the Indians disagree on a certain interpretation of international border between these two countries, as to why we feel that there's a historical problem. The problem is that the Britishers took the areas which were claimed by the Tibetans to be a part of their plateau. And by the way, both these areas are even today inhabited by the Tibetan Buddhists. Class, am I able to communicate my point here or not? Please give me a response on this. Please, I'm waiting upon you to say something here. Class, am I getting through you on these matters? These are important questions. The Johnson line, the McMahon line, the McCartney-Macdonald line we'll take a look at, and then we'll take a look at the line of actual control. Do you get the problem as how it originated between India and China in the first instance? Do you get a sense of what is the nature of dispute between India and China with regard to the border dispute looking at this diagram? What is the Johnson line? What is the McMahon line? What is the alternate that was introduced by China known as the line of actual control? And how it was the Britishers who took certain territories and made the Tibetans sign certain agreements, which the Tibetans later claimed that were done in force. And the Tibetans started asking for their territory back from India. When Tibet became a part of China, you see, when Tibet became a part of China, it was at this stage that the Tibetans told the Chinese that certain parts of the Tibetan territory are marked with India. Those are done by the Johnson line and the McMahon line. And therefore, the Chinese gave an alternate idea to this particular concept known as the line of actual control. And Chinese proposed that Indian troops let go of the territory which is called the territory which is occupied, the territory which was marked by the Tibetans as their own, and they wanted control over that territory and India to reset the international boundary at the line of actual control. But the Indian government refused to do it, and that eventually led to the 1962 war between China and India, by which the Britishers wanted to make this kind of a claim rather emphatically.